Nasreen Abdelmajid, a producer on AMI Today. Coming up in just a moment, Premee Mohamed will be joining us. Premee Mohamed is a Nebula award-winning Indo-Caribbean scientist and speculative fiction author based in Edmonton, Alberta. She's an assistant editor at the short fiction audio venue Escape Pod and the author of the Beneath the Rising series of novels as well as several novellas. Premee is here to talk about her literary award-winning series, The Annual Migration of Clouds. Here's a short synopsis. In post-climate disaster Alberta, a woman infected with a mysterious parasite must choose whether to pursue a rare opportunity far from home or stay and help rebuild her community. The world is nothing like it once was. Climate disasters have racked the continent, causing food shortages, ending industry, and leaving little behind. Then came CAD, mysterious mind-altering fungi that invade the bodies of the now scattered citizenry. Reed, a young woman who carries this parasite, has been given a chance to get away, to move to one of the last remnants of pre-disaster society, but she can't bring herself to abandon her mother and the community that relies on her. When she's offered a coveted place on a dangerous and profitable mission, she jumps at the opportunity to set her family up for life. But how can Reed ask people to put their trust in her? And she can't even trust her own mind. Jacob, what do you, this is a very, I feel like it's one of those synopsis that just gives the perfect amount of description to the book. What do you think?
The funny thing is that because it's such a short book, it's not even 5 hours, at least the first one in the series. It actually says quite a lot about the series, especially specifically that first book. This series, as I was reading it, it took me maybe 10 minutes to get into it because the prose are beautiful. It's incredibly well written and you can tell right away. And we're going to play a sample a little later, which is actually the opening lines of the book, and you'll see what I mean. It's beautifully written. Since this is an interview, it's not a full-fledged review. I just like to say that the way the apocalypse is described here feels very grounded. It doesn't feel over the top, like I mentioned in some other post-apocalyptic series. And the description of the disease, which is called CADS, is disgusting and terrifying. And it reminds me of The Last of Us, which has a parasitic infection, basically spores. It's very similar in that sense, except CADS is more subtle and insidious, and the way that it controls your mind, it doesn't just turn you into a zombie, it controls you subtly, and it actually protects you in a way that feels very violating. It stops you from doing things that would otherwise be dangerous, and that's the thing that it was just more subtle, and it just showed a lot of care on Premee's part. Are you planning on picking this up?
Oh, absolutely. I'm interested. I read The Last of Us, and I felt like it was relating to that. I really loved that storyline. CAD does sound terrifying. So I'm excited to get into this.
Perfect. And I think we're all set to get started. This is our feature interview with Premee Mohamed. It was not instantaneous, the end of the world, the way it is in nightmares. The sky didn't tear open around an asteroid. The earth didn't swallow us up. And of course, the world didn't end the same for everyone. Premee Mohamed, The Annual Migration of Clouds. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. That quote makes me realize the importance of being proactive, and that often problems don't appear, they grow. That last bit about the world not ending the same for everyone is a perfect embodiment of the many themes explored in the Annual Migration of Clouds series. In the story, years after societal collapse caused by environmental disaster and a terrifying new disease, Some communities live in brutal settlements where there's a constant struggle for resources, while others live under the domes where they live in luxury and lack for nothing. The contrast between the two is kind of haunting, and it makes you wonder how it got to be this way. Why were the people under the domes so much better prepared for the apocalypse? Were they just more proactive? Or were they just at the right place at the right time? And now, why do the people that live within the domes not help the ones who live outside? Are those under the domes right to hoard knowledge and resources for themselves in order to preserve some semblance of society? These are all questions that had me pause these audiobooks to give me a minute to reflect. Premee Mohamed is the author of the annual Migration of Clouds series, and she's joining us today. Premee, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, I'm super excited for this. These two short books do a lot of exploration in very little audiobook time. What was the first idea or aspect or scene that became real in your imagination? What was the first thing that came to your head when conceiving the story?
Oh, starting with the easy questions, I see.
Yeah.
Truthfully, it was the disease. It was cadastral myces. I saw a preprint actually go by on my social media feed, and it was about a hereditary symbiont. And I thought that was the most interesting thing I had ever heard. And I kind of rushed off and was like, let's write a sci-fi story about this, and invented the disease. And I thought I would write a short story about the disease. Of course, later I went back and looked at the paper, and it was about Wolbachia, which is an extremely common symbiont of arthropods. And it does do things like regulate their behavior, and it can be passed on from parent to offspring. And in many cases, if it's not passed on, the offspring will either die or it will be unable to produce offspring of its own. So it's actually very, very important. And it's not a parasite or a parasitoid. It is a symbiont. And the way I started for this book was kind of unusual for me, because I normally know exactly how I'm going to sort of drive into a story, like I know the road to go down. For this one, I was driving down and then backing up and turning around and driving down. I thought, okay, let's write a story about the people who discover the disease. That didn't feel quite right. I thought, let's write a story about some parents who are deciding not to have children because they've just found out they have the disease. Not quite. Let's write a story about parents who have already had children and are now horrified because they think they've passed the disease on to them. Still not quite right. Eventually, I came around to, let's write a story about someone who does have the disease and is aware that there's no chance of curing it. And I put the setting in the future because I wanted that to be part of what contributes to everything falling apart. It's hard to concentrate on a global pandemic while everything else is preventing you from focusing money on research and development.
Right. This is so interesting because it seems like you developed the world building first and then constructed a plot and a story and characters around it. Something we talk about on this show regularly is this idea of character, plot, writing, and setting being the four elements of a book that make it enjoyable for readers. And when we've asked people to rank those four elements, again, that's plot, character, writing, and setting. Setting is almost always last. It seems to be the least important thing to people. But in post-apocalyptic books, I'd say that's a priority because the setting often becomes a character in and of itself. Which leads me to my question, why a post-apocalyptic novel in this case? Like, what is it that attracted you to that genre?
I usually refer to it actually as post-apocalyptic. And part of that is because we were just talking about this actually at the Eden Mills Writers Festival. I add the extra post because post-apocalyptic books tend to be focused on the disaster itself and the immediate aftermath of people kind of in reflexive survival mode, and the plot and the characters being most about the extremities of survival. I find those tend to present themselves more as horror. Actually, what I wanted to look at was post-apocalypse. What do you do when the worst is over and you are trying to rebuild? There are still stakes, there are still choices, there are still moral dilemmas, there are still ethical difficulties. That's the kind of book I wanted to write. When I was younger, I was very attracted to the immediate post-apocalypse books. You know, they're kind of fun. They have adventures. There are bandits and mutants and things like that. And I thought, can I write something that is not quite so samey? And I was also really attracted to the idea of doing something not just local, but almost hyper local, because the whole story takes place practically in a single building on a university campus and in a small area of the Edmonton River Valley. So what attracted me about the setting was that I could make it a character in its own right if I could write it with enough detail and care, and if it could be something that legitimately participated in the decision-making processes of the characters, if it could act as a constraint, as a limitation, as something that they constantly have to keep in mind. And if you picked up the characters and the plot and tried to plunk them down in another setting, then the story wouldn't work.
They all link to each other. The setting shapes the characters, and the characters to some extent also shape the setting. Remember, like this society. Could you describe to us the state of the world in these books as they begin?
I can try. As mentioned, there's a lot. The whole planet. It's hard to kind of sum up, I guess. I think the main thing is that I suspect that for many people in the whatever we're at, sort of maybe 80 or 90 years from now, after the events in the story have already occurred, for a lot of people, genuinely, their lives won't have changed all that much. And I am literally thinking of people who are already living without the things that we consider necessities. They're already living without electricity. They're living without internet. They're living without lights, refrigeration, reliable health care,
right,
safety, food, potable water. This is huge swaths of the world still. This is billions of people. For them, the collapse of industrialized society, they'll know, but for them, it may not make a difference. What I'm writing about are stories that are unsettling, I guess, the comfortable, people like us. So for people who are relying on things like electricity and internet and refrigeration and healthcare and vaccines and things like that, the things that make our lives comfortable that we're starting to take for granted, even things like just-on-time delivery. One thing I didn't put explicitly in the stories, but which I was thinking about a lot, was in all these post-apocalyptic stories where people are in modern day going and sort of looting things, stores, warehouses, things like that, and somebody comes by a couple of months later and is able to loot the store again. That is so unrealistic. How long do people think anything is going to last without weekly or daily deliveries? Like, even Walmart gets a delivery of new stuff every day. If that is disrupted, those stores will be empty in 36 hours. You're not going to be able to come by in 18 months and be able to get yourself a nice new pair of jeans. I just wanted to look at a world where things have stopped moving, where deliveries have stopped happening, where there's no, cross-ocean shipping, where there's no flights anymore. The air is empty. People tried to keep the lights on as long as they could and eventually failed. We're back to kind of just pre-industrialized society. And the worst part about at least the story locally is that also there's nothing convenient left to burn. The droughts have killed most of the trees, and you can't burn what's left because you need those for ecological reasons, basically. So they are basically involuntarily reenacting, probably like most of the world, a circular economy. They're burning garbage. They're using garbage as a feedstock because that's what they've got left. And most of it, after 50 or 60 years, has still not broken down. So this is the world as it is. We can no longer rise again to the level that we were because we knocked the ladder out from underneath us of resources and extractive abilities.
An interesting note that I really appreciated was when it's described that people go to the old landfills to see what's available. They find a whole lot of plastic, which is very helpful in a lot of ways. It doesn't really degrade. But like you said, there's very little to burn, and the cold is constantly a problem. And they also reflect on how many books people ended up burning, and how it's very detrimental to the preservation of knowledge, which when you don't have mass communication, these books are hugely crucial, and to just burn them for a momentary amount of heat, I thought that was really interesting, and it spoke to this theme of preservation of knowledge and technology into the book. But before we get deeper into that, I do want to play back a sample. For context, this is a scene where Reed, the main character, receives and explores a letter that she got from House University. It's an acceptance letter. House University is within one of the domes, one of the last bastions of what you might call civilized society. Here's a sample narrated by Eva Tavares.
You don't name it. You don't give it a name either. They must have names they use for each other. I don't know what mine calls itself, and if it told me, I would try to forget. I swear I would. It would not be like the secret names of dogs, which, as a child, I desperately wished to learn. But the name on this envelope is mine, undeniably, printed crisp and black across the pristine paper, trembling in my death grip. Printed by a machine.
That was a sample of The Annual Migration of Clouds. That's the first book in the Clouds series by Premee Mohamed. It was narrated by Eva Tavares. Premee, what is it like for you to hear your work be reinterpreted like this in audiobook format?
God, this was so exciting. This was one of my earliest books, and some of my early books did not get audiobooks. So this was still kind of the highlight of my publishing career when I started to hear the sample portfolios and realize, oh my God, my book is going to be an audiobook. My little novella, which is not really economical to produce as an audiobook, is going to be an audiobook. So that completely blew my mind. I was so excited.
And the narration by Eva was fantastic, seriously. It was really played really well with your prose. There's a short excerpt about how climate change was left to happen in this world that I want to read through because it really hit home for me. On a human scale, it was slow enough that it didn't even seem truly dire. On a geological scale, it seemed that nothing was really happening, till suddenly the feedback cycles tipped over, became too front-heavy to regulate themselves. I heard this idea before, but to hear it articulated this way really clicked for me. It's like the length of the average human lifespan doesn't coalesce well with the relatively slow scale of geological developments, and that makes it so that it's almost impossible for an individual human to grasp the urgency of climate change. And this kind of passage, this kind of messaging, is where your background in environmental sciences really comes through. How did your background in environmental sciences influence this book, in your opinion?
Quite a bit for this one. This was while I was kind of in the thick of a specific project at work, in environmental policy. So I was going through a lot of modeling data, and I was going through a lot of projections, a lot of graphs, a lot of charts, and trying to kind of translate those into a visual for the future of Alberta that I could then put into things like briefing notes. And you start asking yourself questions inevitably, like, what is this province going to look like when the hydrogeological regimes change? When are we going to lose our last glacier? What are the projections saying about what kind of wildlife, what kind of vegetation is going to be left? What's going to die out permanently because it can't move? What's going to stop migrating? What's going to start migrating? What kind of world are we leaving for ourselves just based on the numbers? And that, to me, was kind of fortuitous timing. And I think that's what added to my idea for the disease to form that specific setting, which is kind of a feedback loop in and of itself. You know, climate disasters make it harder to deal with the pandemic. The pandemic makes it harder to deal with climate disasters. And eventually, everything falls apart and people are just scrambling for survival. A lot of what my background really led into, though, was making me very cautious of trying to make it too scientific of a book or too technical of a book. I didn't want to write a textbook, and I didn't think it was appropriate for Reed to know all the details anyway. It's something she's interested in, but as a character and as a reader filtering things through her eyes, I wanted there to be just enough for her to be aware and frustrated that the people who lived before her knew exactly what timescales things were going to happen at, that they had all the data, they had all the knowledge, they actually even had all the solutions, but they never enacted them, and that led to her life being the way it is now.
This makes it seem so predictable, right? You had all the information. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski, and we're talking to Premee Mohamed, the author of the annual Migration of Clouds series, which is available on Sela, in case you're interested. You touched on it just a second ago, and that's how... And I've heard you talk about this in previous interviews, and I thought it was so interesting. And that's how climate change and CADS, the parasitic disease in this book, are two existential problems that seem to mutually stop each other from being solved. And I thought that was such an interesting dynamic. Do you see this sort of dynamic play out in the real world? In other aspects, in other issues that we're dealing with nowadays?
Yeah. I actually learned a term the other day at a conference I was at. Someone used the term multi-crisis or multi-crisis. And I thought, I've never heard that before. That explains a lot. It's kind of the way we see in everybody's lives. When you have a crisis that's big enough, it prevents you from dealing with all the other crises. It's not like you can sit down and carefully allocate time and resources a little bit to each one, because each one is demanding 100 or 110% from you. So I look at things like, climate change. I look at things like loss of biodiversity, water crises, desertification, even things, voter suppression, fascistic regimes, racism, misogyny, everything that's going on in the world that is a massive conflict and is causing loss of life and loss of quality of life would demand so much of us that we feel like if we can't give it 100%, what we should give it is 0. So everything that is happening right now, I feel, is making everything else worse in exactly that type of feedback cycle. And I'm even seeing this in my own life and in the lives of my friends. We're scrambling so fast just to make rent that we can't address other things that are happening in our lives.
Because crisis A takes so much attention, then it stops you from solving crisis B. And if you think crisis B is more important, then you're not going to take care of crisis A. It's honestly, that sounds pretty bleak, because it sounds like it makes both situations unsolvable Is that what you're saying here?
No, I'm just saying, I think that where people feel like they have to give either 0 or 100%, it is realistic to give 10% or 15% and then watch the benefits multiply. One thing I often think of are things like solar panels and farming or ranching. The fact of the matter is, if you put solar panels on land where you are trying to raise, say, sheep or goats, you actually get happier animals. You also get your solar power. You get better biodiversity underneath the panels, and you also get better wool and meat from the sheep. I recently read a paper about this. It's just that people tend to think they have to address one thing at a time, and there can only be benefits to one thing at a time. Whereas, again, we've seen things like, if you address things like car usage in a city and think, okay, well, that's that for carbon, you get to see other benefits. Things like heart disease and respiratory diseases go down. Things like kids' performance in schools academically starts to go up. There's all these knock-on effects that are positive, but people can only really think of the negative knock-on effects. And it's ridiculous to think that doing one small good thing doesn't count. And it has to be giant good things all the time. And I think that's, in a small way, kind of what the books are about. Reed thinks she has to do the big good thing, which is stay and rebuild her community. But she might be making a bigger difference by leaving to do one small good thing for herself, a single person.
It kind of reminds me of how if you have an injury or something that's like nagging you and you get like another injury, it seems like the first injury seems to magically go away. So you can only really concentrate on one issue or pain at a time. But speaking of the body, climate change isn't the only thing that's causing the world in your stories to collapse. The other thing is CADS, the disease. And I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and that was hereditary symbioid. And I'm not sure I followed what exactly that was supposed to be from a biological standpoint. Do you want to enlighten us on what a hereditary symbioid is?
Yeah, hereditary symbiont is... yeah, no worries. That's to try to distinguish it from a parasite, which Reed believes it is, or a parasitoid, which is like a parasite, except that a parasitoid generally kills its host. So technically, a lot of the time, cat is more like a parasitoid. It can kill people, and it'll disable you first. But I was interested also in the idea that it was a fungus. We're not very good, actually, at treating fungal diseases. And I was interested in the idea that it could be passed on, and with kind of a very long sort of period of latency when you wouldn't know for sure if you had it or not because the tests weren't very good. Part of me was kind of like, let's write a story about what the societal effects overall might be on things like reproductive rights and demographics and choices and labor and futures and caretaking of a world in which something sort of like Parkinson's disease was transmissible that way, where it's at a very, very high rate in the population, and you have to take that into account for everything you do. And once you've got it, you can kind of feel your clock start to tick. I also based it on, aside from Wolbachia, which is very interesting, of course, I based it a little bit on cordyceps, which people, I think, know more about from things like The Girl with All the Gifts, like M.R. Carey. And I hadn't actually heard of The Last of Us, but people started making comparisons to it afterwards. Apparently, the series was actually filmed in Alberta.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and that was, of course, years after the book came out, and I was like, this is, like, horrifying, and people were like, you should watch it, you should read it. I'm like, that looks scary. No, thank you. But I was thinking of, and also Ed Young's book, I Contain Multitudes, which I had read years before, and which I think was kind of the seed for this idea that we are not really ourselves, that we are not really entirely ourselves, that we carry a humongous load of fungi and bacteria and viruses and protozoa and things like that, and that we haven't really got a super good grasp on how that affects our personalities and our actions. The E. coli in your gut that is making things like serotonin and dopamine to your body, that is indistinguishable from the stuff that your brain is making. So if you feel a sudden surge of happiness, where is that coming from? Is that coming from you, quote unquote, or is it coming from your gut of bacteria? And I gave myself a little existential crisis about this. I did not like the idea.
Me too.
At all.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. It even leads into things like free will. How do we know that our body full of non-human cells is not affecting our decisions? Well, we don't. So I wanted to explore that idea with this disease as well. And then I thought it would also be interesting to have it be visible on the body after a certain point, because otherwise you absolutely do not know who has it and who doesn't, and they're not able to test for it anymore. So Reed in particular is able to look at her hands and see that she's infected, and also look kind of at the river valley and be like, hey, there's something that grows out there, and there's also something that grows in me. I'm not going to think about it.
And with that, I want to thank you so much for making time for us today. There are 2 books out in the series so far. The second one in the series is called We Speak Through the Mountain. That one came out just this summer. Premee, good luck in all your future writing, and thank you so much for making time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
That was Premee Mohamed, author of the annual Migration of Clouds series. That's all the time we have on AMI Today. If you missed any of our conversation, you can find a repeat of AMI Today on AMI Audio. It repeats every 8 hours, and also find us wherever you find your podcasts. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Thanks for listening.